goes on this like weird side tangent on a quest to like absolve Michael Jackson of being a nonce. It's so weird too, because this is like way after the original court case and before the Neverland documentary. So she's just like doing this out of her own volition, like real dick riding from her. She's like, free my man's Michael, he didn't do nothing except hang out with kids and sleep in their beds and ask for a picture of my daughter when she was a child. Like, Carrie. I use Twitter a lot. I think you can probably figure that out from the everything about me. And on Twitter, there's a writer that I follow who really loves Carrie Fisher's writing. And as she was a writer I think is interesting enough to follow on Twitter, I was intrigued to why that was. She talked a lot about how interesting she thought Carrie Fisher's writing was and how affecting and emotional she was like able to come across when she wrote. I knew that Carrie Fisher wrote outside of her memoirs with her book and the subsequent screenplay of said book, Postcards from the Edge, and also that she did like script doctoring for some random movies like Anastasia, but I was still kind of bewildered that this writer was praising her so highly. I feel like actors who write are given the benefit of the doubt when they write, as if them being able to string together some sentences is something wonderful because otherwise they'd be considered a brain-dead moron or something. Like Bill Hader, who's obviously coming from like a writing background in the sense that everyone who does comedy, at least at first, has to write their own stuff. But then obviously he was on SNL and he started acting, he wasn't writing that stuff. And it wasn't really until Barry where I'm like, yeah, okay, this guy's really good at writing. So I wanted to read her books to really find out why people thought this, because I never give celebrities the benefit of the doubt, especially not Nepo babies. So reading all of her books, like one after the other, does kind of make them blur a little bit. She talks a lot about the same things, but about specific things in like greater detail depending on one book or the other. Therefore, I'm going to talk about all of the books as a whole generally, aside from The Princess Diaries, which I think actually feels a bit different to the others. Carrie Fisher is obviously best known for playing Princess Leia Organa in Star Wars, and then for just about everything else she's done after that. The book, covers a lot of topics. They flit around the same topics, as I said, but in the books, you mainly focus on family and friends. Her illness and addiction usually are kind of discussed together also, and her career. And as a result of who she is, all of these things start to blur together, and you can see why the books also start feeling that way, of like blurring together as well. She calls herself a product of Hollywood inbreeding, meaning that she is a Nepo baby, and she is the daughter of MGM darling Debbie Reynolds and singer Eddie Fisher. Don't worry, I had to look him up too, and I learned that he was actually kind of famous back in the day. And when her parents were together, they were a bit of a 50s power couple. She discusses her family at length, but unlike when other memoirs sort of talk about their family problems, all of her problems are about famous people that you also care about. She does try to make you feel bad about caring about gossip, but I mean, are you really picking this book up if you don't care about insider Hollywood news? No. She also knows who's going to buy this book, so she is poking fun at you, but like, she's not dumb. She knows where she's getting the money from. She explains that her dad was pretty absent and therefore she mainly lived with her mum. She also seemed to live with her half-siblings from her dad's side, but they were looked after by her mum, which seems messy, but it definitely comes across like they were all very close to each other. She also discusses the fact that her mum had other marriages and what it was like sort of living with these other father figures, and also how her mother would essentially be broke after every single husband because they would all just spend her money. She then goes on to talk about things like leaving school and instead being in the chorus of her mum's show instead of like finishing high school, and how she thinks that perhaps affected both her knowledge but also the way that she interacts with people. Also, everyone she talks about interacting with, and sure, it must partially be because, she knows what people want to hear and what will sell her books, are famous people, because she has always been surrounded by famous people. When her dad cheats on her mum with another woman and leaves to marry her, the new woman isn't like some random, it's Elizabeth Grant. You're like, whoa, talk about name drop. But then I guess you have to be like, bro, her mum is Debbie fucking Reynolds. Like, it's only ever going to be like the coolest name drops ever. And she also says because of her upbringing and the way nearly everyone her mum knew and hung out with was like show businessy or famous, she didn't really get shocked about meeting famous people. And she reiterates this like lots of times, and honestly, fair enough. She talks about meeting famous people a lot, but to her, she's just now met a new person because that starstruck quality doesn't really exist for her. No one can really be larger than life when your mum is Debbie Reynolds. And you feel this when she talks about how her mum and Lizzie Grant were even besties till she took her husband. And then way later in life, her and Elizabeth Grant actually became friends when she let Elizabeth Grant push her into a pool. She reiterates that she does not get starstruck often, but she did get starstruck by Cary Grant. This is one of my favourite stories that she tells, and it's funnier when she says it than when anyone else says it, so here's a quote from her. Anyway, at a certain point in my early 20s, my mother started to become worried about my obviously ever-increasing drug ingestion, so she decided to do what any concerned parent would do. She called Cary Grant. It's fucking great. So basically, her mum gets Cary Grant to call Carrie to tell her not to drop any acid, because apparently he was like a part of some experiment at some point in his life documenting how bad acid was for you. And her mum thought she was really into acid. She wasn't, but she was into a lot of other drugs. So Cary Grant would essentially get on the phone to her and tell her how bad acid would be to her. Spoiler, drugs aren't something she gives up, regardless of what Cary Grant told her. But imagine your drug talk coming from Cary Grant. Like, that is insane. She's just like always had a bit of an insane life. She also kind of goes on to talk about things like how much she missed her mom when she was little, because she would be off filming a lot. So when she was around, her and her brother would essentially sleep in the same room as her mother and stepfather, like on the rug or like by the windowsill, just to be in the same room as her. And she brings up things like how her mum offered to do pot with her when they were younger, and when they didn't actually end up doing it, she just ended up smoking it alone. So she just started getting into weed from like 13 years old, and essentially all of her relationships with drugs was very Hollywood, so Hollywood. She generally talks little about being married, but she does mention how cool it was to have love songs written about her, especially by Paul Simon, which I did not know was the Simon part of Simon and Garfunkel, as I looked it up, and therefore her saying this about the love songs written about her is way cooler after knowing that fact. She has lots of like interesting famous people stories, so if you're all about that, I do highly recommend reading Wishful Drinking and Shopaholic. But from both of those names, you can probably guess that a big part of her life and these books are drinking and drugs. She talks about getting ECT, which is electroshock therapy, and how that pretty much was the main reason, at least, that she was able to remain sober. Though she got sober because she wanted to try for her daughter and because she was really depressed at the time. And as someone who has also now seen Billie Lourd and things, she's her own separate entity to me, even though she is, Carrie Fisher's nepo baby daughter. But like, when reading these books, you can really see how much she loves her daughter. She really is like everything to Carrie Fisher. I don't know, I don't like being over familiar with it, Carrie Fisher. So in these books, she's just Carrie Fisher's daughter, really. She talks very like clearly about how she's disappointed her daughter in many ways because she's let like drugs take over her life. And also about her BPD, which has generally lent her to become an addict. It essentially in her life creates an atmosphere and a mindset where only taking copious amounts of drugs was going to help her through any episode. She says, so this is a quote from her. She says, "You know how most illnesses have symptoms you can recognize, like fever, upset stomach, chills, whatever? Well, with manic depression, it's sexual promiscuity, excessive spending, and substance abuse. And that just sounds like a fantastic weekend in Vegas to me." So all of her coping mechanisms and addictions were essentially a symptom of her BPD, and her life situations sort of exacerbated a need for coping mechanisms like those. And I think in some of her stories, she does come off like, okay, boohoo Carrie, I don't know if I'm massively that sorry for you, you're a successful actor with rich famous parents, and you have to kind of come back to the BPD and be like, okay, she probably did all of those things, not because she's a total asshole, but because of that. But yeah, she talks a lot about losing memories because of the ECT rehab stint, but also losing a lot of her life to drugs as well. Wishful Drinking, the book, is also written alongside a show that she did called Wishful Drinking. So it's kind of like a companion piece to the show, and she talks about doing the show in Shopaholic as well. And she talks also in Shopaholic about how she reconnected with her father around the time of the show, and how he came back into her life mainly because he needed to be looked after, but that she was okay with that because at least he was around. That kind of tells you some things about her, I think. Her life is never really looked at linearly in the books, but in pieces. The structure makes it hard to piece together her life in a sort of personal life section of Wikipedia way, but I think it feels like we're getting drip-fed insight into her life, which I think is a good thing. I don't think she wanted people to think that they were close to her after reading her books, because on a general level, I think over-familiarity towards her happened like a lot. And generally, her career is so Star Wars based, like, duh. She says over and over again in all of her books several times that she feels defined by it, which all in all kind of makes sense. She feels defined by the movies and what Leia said or did and how it reflects on her, especially the way Leia used to look, and i.e., how she used to look. She definitely had some body image issues, and while she does seem to be at peace with it, she did dig into herself throughout the books about how she looks now, and how essentially she doesn't like the way she looks, and how she also hates the way that society, and more importantly Hollywood, makes it seem like she shouldn't age or look different. She also talks about how people are only obsessed with her because they're obsessed with Leia, and she had Leia's face. She says, "I liked being Princess Leia, or Princess Leia's being me. Over time I thought we'd melded into one. I don't think you could think of Leia without my lurking in that thought somewhere, which is an interesting thing to say. But she also thinks that her body is sort of taken from her at times because of the fact that she has no rights to any of the Star Wars merchandising, and whatever they put her on is still her face, but it's not her, and like no permission was taken from her to like put her stuff on things. So generally people not being obsessed with her, but just Leia is probably not true considering the rabidness of the fan base, but in part I can see why. A lot of the fans, I think, expected her to be Leia and therefore perform Leia in any way they wanted because they thought they deserved it. So in The Princess Diarist, my favourite of them, there are sections where she kind of paraphrases the way like that fans talk to her, and there are fans that are like so demanding, or the really nice ones who, whilst are normal, overshare in a way that make their like behaviours seem nice. The ones who expect to be like remembered, the ones who have her tattooed on them, the ones who have dogs and babies named after her, or even Leia, the ones who act subtle like they aren't obsessed but like very obviously are. Hearing and reading these parts definitely, in my opinion, helps to kill any part or level of parasocial relationship you may have with the celebrity, because when she writes in a very cavalier way of how these will sound to her as the celebrity in the scenario, it feels like you're insane you ever thought that kind of thing. Doesn't matter if you're an outright fan or a shy one or a sly one, it all sounds bonkers when she explains it. Because at the end of the day, like, she's still human, and saying any level of that kind of shit to a human being is mentally unsound, regardless of what, like, celebrity culture sells you. And even how she says, you know, it's a fantasy that she sells you so that she can make money. She doesn't really talk in detail about any of the Star Wars movies, like, during filming or anything like that, but more about how they affected her. It's wild when she references it as like this low-budget sci-fi film she dropped out of drama school to do. Because like, yeah, that is what it is, but it's so far from what the public sees the phenomenon as. And she doesn't even really talk about her writing that much either. She does say, however, it keeps me focused for long enough to complete thoughts, to let each train of thought run to its conclusion and let a new one begin. It keeps me thinking. I'm afraid that if I stop writing, I'll stop thinking and start feeling. And I think this quote is like incredible, because I think if you've ever felt like you need to write to stop yourself feeling like you're actually melting into your organs from the outside, you'll probably understand the sentiment that she's making here. She talks about her feelings a lot and the need to compartmentalize, a need to understand herself, her illness and her life, and something she says about this is, I wish I could explain, and armed with that explanation, somehow excuse the seemingly unending, ongoing, relentless, inordinately intense, pathetic fixation I have with my feelings. That wilderness lurking somewhere down south in my bisolar plexus, and simultaneously right back in the back of my eyes, demanding my attention and eternally taking my emotional temperature. How do I feel? No, really, how do I feel? How could I feel? Some other way, surely. By the end of this endless archaeological self-examination, the observer part of your mind doesn't know what it's looking at anymore. Because being both archaeologist and pit, essentially, don't make me say it, oh fuck, okay, the pits. Just incredible. And generally, this main stance of hers on writing is incredibly evident when you read her diary entries. A lot of the Princess Diaries is dedicated to chronicling the events and feelings that transpired during her affair with Harrison Ford during the shooting of A New Hope. She doesn't really talk about the movie outside of how she felt about picking the hairstyle that would come to define how the hair came to be so important to her and the life and the movie, and also how George Lucas is kind of creepy sometimes. Instead, we kind of mainly get a look into their affair. It genuinely seems heartbreaking. She never really badmouths him, though she probably ought to sometimes. And also, in an insane understanding of the world, she writes that she wants to tell this story to the public, even though she would probably regret it later in her life, because she doesn't want the story to be misconstrued if anyone decides to tell the story after she dies. And this becomes an absolute girl boss move when she dies like 2 weeks after the publication of this book. Which also means she never has to regret writing this because she died kind of immediately. Her diary entries are just like so beautiful. They're poetic and strong-minded. They're written with like conviction and talent in a way you wouldn't find in a normal diary entry. All of my diary entries are all about being sad. And to be fair, most of hers are about how twisted up and miserable Harrison Ford made her too. I don't write like half as incredibly about how sad having 6 assignments due in a week makes me as she does about being in love with Harrison Ford. This is one of my favourite quotes from her. I don't dare pick a topic for fear it won't be funny enough or interesting enough for his awe-inspiring judgment. With his silence, he establishes himself as a sort of trapped audience, and so you break your ass to meet the enormous challenge of entertaining him.
frantic with worry that his teeth might suffocate. Oh, he's very funny sometimes with his parched sense of humour, but he only plays himself part-time. I work myself around the clock. Obviously, I have not heard about the child labour laws, but then I have not totally accepted that I am no longer a child. Once I do, I will have to accept responsibility for everything I do. Chills, literal chills. And this one. I confide in everyone. I have no restricted private self, reserved specifically for certain trusted special people. I trust and mistrust anyone. I have travelled a full circle. But this time, on returning to zero again, I am able to act out the mistake more adeptly. I am on my way to becoming a very skilled loser, a specialist, a loser to end all losers, a flair for failing. I do it with style and finesse.
I think these entries are just so thoughtful, so very imbued with the sensibility that comes with being 19 years of age, but also the heartbreak of something that means something to her, something that she put into this book knowing that it was going to end up meaning everything to a lot of people that are not her too, even though this was like a personal experience for her. And not to be parasocial, but because I think she would hate that, but I can't imagine how mind-altering the entries about her requited loves would be, seeing the bewildering calibre of these entries. And she only gives us like 10 in this. Generally, that Twitter writer was probably right. You know, Carrie Fisher is a great writer, though I will say The Princess Diaries sort of blows the other ones out of the water. Not because it's about Harrison Ford or even because her diary entries are stunning, but because the themes she covers in fame and celebrity feel rawer there than it does anywhere else. She doesn't want to shame her fans. She gets why she's important to them, but not why they act that way. She can't ever complain like the way she probably wanted to, because she can't say that some of those losers are ballistic and needed help, but you know, I can. She's very open for a celebrity too, but glib when she needs to be. Especially when everything and everyone you know is famous. How much can you really tell about someone? If I do an embarrassing story about my uncle, who cares? He won't, and you won't. But if she does, she's suddenly sort of like spilling secrets and opening a hole into seeing someone famous as reality, which can't be good for business when someone's image is probably their like money maker. But I think she toes that line like delicately, and she still manages to tell everyone like fascinating meat on the bone stories about herself and others in a way that makes her very like likable, poignant, and interesting. Perhaps more importantly, in a way that really makes you want more. She's engaging because she's famous and everyone she talks about is also famous, but she's wonderful because she kind of has your attention. That scattered structure, the dry tone, and perhaps the fake forward attitude in her writing that sort of makes her stand out in a way the other celebrity writers do not. I highly recommend checking out her stuff on audiobook as it's all read by her, but ignore what I said when it comes to The Princess Diaries, because I think you'll definitely need a real copy of that one, because you're going to want to read those entries by yourself, which is like in the middle, all of her diary entries. I think you need to read that with your eyes. But yeah, thanks for watching. I'm kind of sad I couldn't find my Stormtrooper top to wear for this because I have it. Don't know where it is though. But yeah, thank you for watching. I liked these books and I highly recommend you go read them, especially The Princess Diaries. Especially if you like Star Wars in any which way. I definitely think this sort of insight into fan culture, Carrie Fisher, and the shooting of A New Hope will make you think of Star Wars in a different light. A little bit, at least.